Hey, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. Today, we're going to be digging into the question of if you're invested in attack surface management, how do you know it's working? Before we get started, I want to remind everyone that you can freely comment. There's a chat module where you can ask questions. We've got our moderated team, they'll pass it to us. We'll be taking those questions and I'll be bringing them up through our conversation. But if your question doesn't get selected, we also have a dedicated time at the end for Q&A. So we've got a great panel here, so we're going to jump right in. I'll introduce myself first. My name is Mark Goodwin. I'm the Director of Managed Security Services here at Bishop Fox. I lead the team that's responsible for the attack surface management platform and service that Bishop Fox offers. I've been at Bishop Fox here for 5 years, seen the platform and the service grow and iterate to evolve with threats that we've monitored, technology that's grown, and customers and their requests. To kick it over to our experts, I'll start with Chris. You want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Mark. So I'm Chris Ray. I'm a field CTO here at Gigaom. Prior to working here, I'm not an analyst. I've always been hands-on practitioner role, worked the help desk, worked everything in between there, and a CISO role at a startup. With that, I bring a wealth of experience that's very tactical, very pragmatic, and focused on the technology at hand, which is why ASM is such a dear to me technology.
Yeah, super important, and it's definitely the future of cybersecurity. Sergio, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you. Nice to meet you. Everyone, my name is Sergio Villegas, or however you want to pronounce my last name. I'm a senior managing analyst at Bishop Fox. I lead one of the teams that is responsible for one of the different procedures that we do at the managed service, which is the discovery of the attack surface of our customers, right? I've been doing this for 3 years so far at Bishop Fox, and I particularly have experience in threat intelligence and intelligence in general, right? Which is how we are approaching a lot of work right now at Bishop Fox. So yeah, nice to meet you all.
Awesome. Thank you, Sergio. And over to you, Richard.
Hey, I'm Richard Brown. Nice to meet you all as well. I'm a senior managing operator here at Bishop Fox. I've been here as well almost 4 years now. Prior service, I was a principal penetration tester at Focal Point and did some other things in law enforcement intelligence.
Very cool.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for all that, guys. Like I said, the topic of conversation today is going to be on attack surface management. We got 3 main points that we got a handful of points, but the 3 main points that we want to talk about is reviewing the Gigaom radar report, talking through common misconceptions, how do decision makers evaluate ASM solutions, and misconceptions that they may have. We're going to talk about trends and emerging challenges. What is the current state of ASM in this industry based on research-backed insights? And then finally, how do we measure that effectiveness of an ASM solution? How do they compare to real-world threats? What are attackers doing against attack surfaces? And where do ASM solutions succeed or fail? So definitely excited to talk about all those things, but we're going to start off with the radar report.
Certainly. I feel like that's a good place for me to jump in. So here at Gigaom, we produce what's called a radar report. That culminates into a graphic, which you see here. But let's take a step back before we kind of dive into exactly what we're looking at. This is a very busy radar. When we approach a technology domain like ASM or any other, it could be CNAP or XDR, EDR, whatever the domain is, we have to draw a circle around what we think that domain is. We have to create table stakes. If you are this technology, you perform these things, you have these capabilities and features. Those are table stakes. To differentiate the vendors and help buyers make the right decisions for themselves, we then establish key features. And these are the differentiating features and capabilities between the technologies. And then a little further down the road, we're looking at what are the emerging features? What are the new things that these vendors are creating that are not common yet, but will provide value in the next 18 to 36 months. And then to put a nice bow on it, we also give you a set of evaluation criteria. We call them business criteria, things like scalability, flexibility, cost of ownership, etc. So in the radar report, we establish the table stakes. We give you key features and emerging features. We evaluate the vendors. We score them on a scale of 0 to 5. Same with the business criteria. And then we chart that out using maths, as you can see here. Generally, closer to center is better, but that's not always the case. What the true intent of the radar is if you can see here, there's about 30 vendors. You can't obviously go to every vendor and ask them, you know, the same questions. It's not reasonable. It's not efficient. The real purpose of the radar is to create a short list. These are the 3, 4, 5 vendors I'm going to talk to when I'm either acquiring new or reassessing what I have. These are the ones that seem like they're going to tick the boxes for the capabilities that I need. So what you see here is all of that information charted out in a graphical format. Left to right is feature versus platform. Top to bottom, we're considering the maturity of the solution versus the innovation track record, and that's really just considering how quickly do they bring in new features, how quickly are they adding new features on day 1 versus day 900 of your engagement with them. How much will that technology change? So that chart's top to bottom.
That's great perspective. It's good to know that the intent is to help build that short list. And, I'm definitely glad to be on that list. So thank you for including us. Because I do think it's important that we continue to iterate, that we continue to grow and change, because cybersecurity is always growing and changing. So it's good to have that, short list of companies that are out there trying to solve this problem. So speaking of solving the problem, right? Like, we know that there's a vast ASM market, right? There was over 30 customers on that list. Chris, when you look at the market today, what are some of the biggest misconceptions you're seeing amongst security leaders?
Yeah, so I have friends that are still, hands-on practitioners, and they see the value that ASM can provide. They see it solving problems that they're either doing manually or just not at all, and it's just a gap that they have in their defenses or in their security operations. When they take that and they say, hey, boss, we need to consider adopting ASM. Here's what it gets us. The most common feedback that they receive is we've already got heavily invested into vulnerability management. We're already heavily invested into our exposure management. We're already doing this. We're already spending money here. What does this get us? So there's that misconception that ASM is just sort of like vulnerability management 2.0. And that's not at all what it is. Obviously, we can talk more about what that is and what the differences are later. I think number one, completely throwing away the idea that the ASM evolved out of the vulnerability management space is a really good starting point.
I completely agree. Vulnerability management will always have a place, but to understand the entire attack surface is super important, especially when it's backed by intelligence, and that's what drives the entire decision-making process. Sergio, with your work in attack surface intelligence, what's one thing organizations miss relating to vulnerability management and they're thinking their attack surface is fully covered?
100%. And kind of continuing on what Chris was mentioning about the plethora of different vendors that you may have and how ASM is not only vulnerability management 2.0, but there is certain intricacies, right? And one of the things with attack surface management and understanding if you are fully covered, right, it's really realizing how big your attack surface can be. And that's why I mentioned, right, that I used to work or I have a lot of experience in intelligence. And intelligence is really important when you apply those concepts into attack surface management, right? You want to understand your entire organization. It's not only about like, yeah, I have these IPs and I will scan those IPs, right? And I think Chris can agree with that. It's about like fully understanding your organization. Like, hey, I have cloud assets. I have these different, I don't know, subsidiaries, and they are independent from an infrastructure perspective. So at what point I'm stop being responsible or owner of all of that, right? And you need to incorporate all of that knowledge, and that's why Bishop Fox we are doing this from an intelligence perspective, and why we hyper focus the discovery, right? It's understanding the whole perspective and the whole what entitles the whole attack surface, right? It's not only I have 5 IPs. It's I have multiple organizations in that are owned by my main organization, and I have cloud assets, and I have my marketing team that buys domains randomly, and they point those to random services in Google, right? Like it's really intricate how the different organizations can move and how fast can that happen. So applying, and I think that's the one thing that organizations not necessarily miss, but I think cybersecurity teams are kind of blindsided sometimes, right? They try to act fast, right, with how fast they can act, versus all of these different environments that you are dealing with and your different infrastructure teams. So it's a lot to digest. So that's one very good point that you need to always have at the top of your head, right? Like, hey, I'm fully covered. The answer will likely be no, and it's like how you can and Chris taking some of your points from the radar, right? Like, hey, is this vendor will help you to partner up with you to understand your attack surface from all of these different perspectives, or it's just gonna be a quick, yeah, I will check your attack surface top 5 domains and that's it, right? Understanding what's your approach and how you want to do it. I think that will be key. So yeah, I think that's how organizations can often miss something, right? But it's very intricate when you look at it.
Yeah, and what you've done is you've drilled into the fundamental difference that I was trying to illustrate there between vulnerability management and ASM. Really, what it comes down to is with the vulnerability management program, these are assets you're aware of that you're tracking already. That you've got some sort of object somewhere that you're aware of. ASM is filling in the gaps, like you said. The marketing team does wild stuff. You give them a credit card and some SaaS applications, turn them loose, and well, now you have those unknowns. And that's really where ASM differentiates itself from vulnerability management.
100%.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think a lot of the misconception is that they use it for asset tracking and not necessarily the full correlation of their attack surface.
Yeah, I think it's worth calling out that like intelligence is messy, right? Sergio kind of alluded to customers having subsidiaries and mergers and acquisitions happen all the time. And so at the end of the day, that parent company is going to be responsible for security and making sure that we're doing the right things to cover not only the parent company, but all subsidiaries. And how do we track all of that? Especially not every merger and acquisition, not every, parent child relationship is going to be great. And so like having an ASM platform help walk that out and tease that out, I think is really important. Richard, you called out that like it's important and we see it everywhere. What about from the offensive perspective? Do you think organizations are most overconfident in one area?
Yeah, I think the overconfidence is that they understand their full attack surface. As Chris mentioned earlier, like a lot of the issue is when you look at organizations, they are able to track their IPs and their host names that they immediately know about, but the new stuff that pops up, they're unaware of them. And even in that case, they are tracking them that they exist, but not the vulnerabilities that exist on them. They're not tracking the versions of the software, the underlying plugins, the things that are running behind the scenes. And then it's really messy when you have so many teams and organizations that build their own things, that design their own infrastructures, and then try and have them commingle and understand both sides of the house. It's just,
yeah, it's not even new stuff, right?
Mhm.
How often are services and resources decommissioned? Well, are they decommissioned completely? Or is there like some DNS record out there pointing to some object that can be taken over in AWS? You don't know about those things because it's like, well, that was a project last quarter. It's complete. We've decommissioned this thing. We're not going to be concerned about it anymore. Well, how confident are you that it's been fully decommissioned?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's a conversation we have literally with our customers every day, right? Like attack surface is not about just the asset by itself, but everything around it, right? Like DNS is super important. And I like it, it's not like a term or something, but I like to call all of that your extended attack surface, right? You have random DNS entries in your cloud environments that are pointing to IPs, and they have your certificates, they have your content. So agreed, you are decommissioning what of all of what entitles the asset itself, right? And that's why we have conversations around like stale entries being taken over by Richard, by your team, right? And it gets really it's kind of interesting and fun to see that. It's not fun for organizations, right, to have that impact.
Sergio, you talked about certificates and everything else. We had a question come in. What open source tools can be used for ASMs? This is, I think, both questioning about OSINT as well as like what are the things that, if I'm a practitioner, if I'm maybe not a security leader, but I'm on a security team and I want to start doing this by myself as I try to justify budget for an actual solution, what would be some things that you could do?
Sure. I think depends on what you want to do, right? For example, I just mentioned certificates. So from a certificate perspective, something like certificate transparency tools like CRT.sh that do a great job of like trying to pull assets and the match between assets and and your certificates, things like tools like Shodan, right? That we use if you want to track like your acquisitions, your mergers and acquisitions, because we understand, right? Like the cybersecurity departments, both, right? Like the people operating and the CISOs, CTOs, they don't necessarily are tracking what the business is doing, and that is completely fine. So they can use tools such as like what we do is I don't know how to pronounce this, how to pronounce it, but there is Trace XN, which is a platform that allows you to like it's not a cybersecurity platform. It's a business platform for tracking mergers, acquisition, financials. For US based companies, you have Edgar, which is a repository of uh, tax related information for US companies, where you can see all of that papers where they submit like, hey, yeah, I acquired a new company basically, and you can use like Google, ChatGPT. All of that is really useful when you are trying to like track these types of information. Uh, I think that covers a bit. It's not. I think we're a lot because we have like dozens of tools, right? So it depends on the approach you want to take. But that for starters,
Yeah.
I think is great.
Yeah, I was gonna say it really hinders on what you're looking to achieve. If you're looking for IP addresses, right? Aaron is a good use. It tracks all of that. If you're looking for more what assets you have, we can look up subdomain enumeration tools. It really looks at what it really depends on what you're trying to achieve with the open source.
Yeah, it's a nuanced answer for a very broad question, right? Like it's which slice of the pizza do you want to start with first? Because there is so much out there, right? It is, you can start with domains, you can start with subdomains, you can start with networks, or you can go broader and look at the mergers and acquisitions, the SEC filings that Sergio talked about, because there's a lot of information and data out there, and part of it is just like raw human grit and figuring out what makes sense for you and your platform and for your processes. And then there are some good open source tools out there. CertSH is it was a good call out, Sergio. Thank you. So we talked about misconceptions that security leaders have or organizations may have. I think it's important to also talk about emerging trends, what we see in the market, how the industry is moving as a whole, and then where we can start to address some of those misconceptions. Chris, since you track it so closely, what trend or shift in ASMs are you seeing?
Yeah, so there's the overall improvement of the solution, the enhancement of all the capabilities, the key features, the emerging features that I've touched on. Of those, though, there's two items that are really outpacing the rest of them. Whatever the drivers are for them, I don't have the answer there, but I can tell you security leadership and practitioners both, they see the effectiveness of ASM and what it does for, air quotes around this, their external attack surface. I'm of the position that your attack surface is attack surface regardless of where it exists, external, internal. So they see the effectiveness there and they're like, geez, this would be really great if we could get something similar for our internal attack surface. Because although, the assumption is you don't build something unless you're tracking it in most organizations, even the smallest ones. They keep a spreadsheet of something. Here's our cloud spend. That's not always the case. Like I said, decommissioning improperly can create gaps. Testing, DevOps, can create resources at incredible speeds. So a very similar challenge exists on the inside as it does on the outside, and that's knowing what you have in order to secure it. So I'm seeing a shift. Some vendors are enabling their customers, their buyers, to use similar technologies or use their same platform to perform ASM-like discovery on the inside and perform ASM-like correlations and risk identification inside of their networks, whether that's hybrid on-prem or in the cloud. The other piece that I'm seeing rapid acceleration is finding new novel ways to bring threat intelligence into the platform, either in-house or partnering with somebody like a Recorded Future and that whole gang of people. And then not just enriching the assets that you've discovered, like, hey, we know that there's a lot of chatter about this specific type of Apache, and therefore it's probably more vulnerable to attacks in the future, but also using that threat intelligence to discover to correlate, to add and refine the quality of alerts that you're getting out of your ASM solution. You know, I'm open to talking about either of those, whichever way you guys want to go here.
Definitely. I definitely want to tackle the external versus internal, because I know that will be a debate that rages for pretty much all eternity, right? But going in on threat intelligence first I think what's most intriguing and is probably one of the hardest challenges to solve. Sergio, I know you've been doing a lot of work in understanding threat intelligence, making it offensive and more than just a data feed for customers, because there is so much information out there. How do you think that impacts the way we do discovery, the way we handle, you know, from an ASM perspective, threat intelligence?
Sure, and I think I actually agree with Chris, right? Like, biggest challenge making that whole threat intelligence actionable, right? And particularly in offensive security, it's kind of a it's kind of the enemy. Threat intelligence is kind of the enemy, right? It's almost opposites, because normally threat intelligence is it's your blue team, your defensive team kind of activities, but there's a lot of information that you can use offensively into that, right? For example, you have Chris mentioned your external, your internal attack surface. So what are specific actors doing in the different technologies that you may have in there, right? How are you correlating both at the same time? Okay, so this is my list of, let's say, CPEs that I have exposed in all of my external attack surface. Is there any actor, so I can ask any different platforms, or I can do the research myself, right? Like, hey, is there any actors that are attacking these specific CPEs? And I think that's easier to elevate to not only like your tactical operational teams, but also your strategic teams, like, right? Like, hey, this is why I need threat intelligence. This is why, because it's time consuming. That's also something important. It's time consuming, right? It's not like, hey, yeah, I can do threat intelligence tomorrow. Let's do it. No, it takes time. It takes a lot of investment into what information to pull. So I think using both best of both worlds, right? Like, you have your ASM, your manual, if you want to do it manually, your inventory of assets with specific technologies, and you are seeing this specific actor attacking this platform. So that could help a lot to deliver a more proper course of action or strategy, right? Like, hey, so because of this situation, we maybe want to focus on protecting these assets with somehow, right? Depending on your strategy, a countermeasure, a fix, something else, or deprecating those assets because they are old, right? So I think that's how you can use trade. That's a way, right? That's not perhaps the solution, but that's a way how you can leverage the threat intelligence to, like, combine it with offensive security. And personally, that's a battle I've been having, right? Of offensive security, threat intelligence, they don't really match together, but you can actually do it. You just need to be open to it and accepting, right, that you need to combine best of both worlds. That's kind of like for starters, right? But I know we can deep dive into threat intelligence, but I don't want to deviate the conversation that much.
Yeah, and from the threat intelligence piece, I think that's important. But then, Richard, I know that, you know, you're tracking emerging threats. What are security researchers doing? How does that inform understanding of attack surfaces?
Yeah, I think going back to the correlation of attacks to actually like how impactful they are to the client is a big piece of it. You have a lot of noise in the industry of people saying that this is super vulnerable, super bad, and you need people to decipher that to see what the actual issue is that underlies it. Right? We have several times where clients will ask us about a CVE that comes out that's in 15 different news press articles, and you're like, cool, yeah, but it's got like a lot of mitigating circumstances. It's got a lot of dependencies that you don't have on your attack surface. But they still take that time to deep dive into that to make sure. And that's something that I feel like a lot of times is overlooked in what a attack surface management does on the back end, right? Like, we're not just doing detections on everything you have. You have Apache exposed, and we're saying it's vulnerable because it's less than 2.6, right? We're doing deep dives into what actual vulnerabilities you have on that asset to reduce that noise from the rest of the world that you're receiving.
Yeah, keeping high signal to noise, right? Like, if you're paying for a service, it needs to empower you, not slow you down and just be yet another data feed.
Yeah.
Chris, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, you know, I think we're going to touch on it a little bit later, but when you start looking at how you evaluate a solution, its ease of use is going to be paramount. And this isn't, I use ease of use across a lot of different domains, XDR, CNAP, cloud workload security, ASM. They mean different things across all of those. But with ASM, like you said, it can't just be another source of information. It needs to be a very concise summary of the risk that's presented, why it's a risk, and then how you can mitigate or what your options are. So I agree with all the things Sergio and Richard you just said. And really what those boil down to for me is measuring how easy the solution is for your organization to adopt and operationalize.
Yeah, I agree.
Go ahead, Richard.
Go ahead. I was going to say, adoption is definitely, I think, the part. It has to become ingrained in your ecosystem, not just the tool you query every once in a while.
And the thing I wanted to mention is not necessarily disagreeing with you, Chris, but I wouldn't necessarily kind of put aside the level of detail you can get, particularly in ASM, right? When you talk about like remediation processes and whatnot, it can get very technical, right? It's not.
Oh, yeah.
While ease of use is great, you also need like a very dedicated expert team that are providing the value of explaining things coherently and that it makes sense, right? You can just like sacrifice one for the ease of use. But I kind of agree. But I will personally, when I used to operate, I will like the more technical details better. But ease of use is it's important.
And I think that's the beauty of a managed service, right? Like it's not a platform where like, here is your ticket with your notification. It is instead, here's information with human-backed follow-up to give you that extra verbose communication for the practitioners. And then you got executive level summaries for anybody else who just needs to be aware of what's happening. Chris, the other thing that you did talk about was internal versus external and how we're kind of seeing that growth in the industry. I know what Bishop Fox is doing, and like we are focused right now solely on external because that's where we view a lot of the attack surface. But I'd love to get your insights on the internal and talk through that with the team here.
Yeah. So when organizations initially adopt ASM, oftentimes it's green money. They're not shifting that spend from something else into ASM. So that's probably the most hypercritical moment of a new technology's adoption. Is it a one-to-one or one-to-many as far as dollars spent and value received? So it's really under the lens. And I think a lot of organizations, after their evaluation period, maybe they sign up for a 12-month service contract just to evaluate. They're not all in yet. At the end of that 12 months, they go, wow, that worked a lot better than we expected. We didn't think it was going to be that effective. But then they take a step back and they realize they have a very similar set of problems on the inside, right? So then they immediately go, well, let's just do that again on the inside. So that's really the genesis for this, because like I touched on a minute ago, although the inside is managed better than what's exposed to the outside, the external attack surface, there are still gaps. There are still unknowns. Confidence levels vary on how well you're doing things. So when an organization is considering better securing their internal attack surface, if we're going to segment it, immediately they go to, well, how can we best discover what we have? And that's really ASM solutions are the principal technology at discovering assets, objects, resources, services, and correlating those risks on the outside. So of course it makes sense. People are going to say, well, can't we just do that on the inside? Now, how that actually happens varies from solution to solution. Some are agent-based, some are agent-less. Some rely on API integrations to things like ServiceNow, a service desk, CMDBs, and other things like that. I'm not going to say there's a optimal method of doing that. Maybe it's a hybrid, a mix of all of them together. That really hasn't shown yet. It hasn't been proven one way or the other. We're kind of at the wait and see moment for that.
Yeah, I love that there's no like service standard, right? Like when you go to get an oil change, you know exactly what you're going to get. When it comes to internal attack surface management, like it is hard and complicated and nuanced, and it's going to be a hard problem to solve because of the way that most ASMs use other information to feed that in. Sergio and Richard, I know we focus on the external, I guess, kind of understanding the need for internal. What would you say how would you prioritize if you're an organization trying to understand attack surface management solutions?
Yeah, I think the ultimate goal of the external is to get inside, right? And then to laterally move throughout the organization. Being able to detect those methods or the attack paths an attacker might take prior to gaining entry is definitely valuable to teams. It's definitely a tougher, tougher sell when you are trying to figure out how to go about doing that in a multi-platform system where you have to contend with not only Windows but Linux and Mac users as well. Um, I mean, yeah, it's definitely one of those challenges that's going to be fun to solve. I know that there are companies out there that solve it now. We have the AWS companies that insert their own EC2 and start scanning your stuff from there, from inside. But yeah, I mean, from the attacker's perspective, it does make sense that we want to find those before we gain external entry. I think we focus so much on the findings of now we gain entry and do lateral movement that we don't think about if we would have prevented this lateral movement, then the external entry is very less. It's a mitigating circumstance of that external entry.
Yeah. And from a discovery standpoint, I think the biggest challenge is the users, right? Or the environment of the users, because yes, you can have like your local server infrastructure, let's say your data center, right? And in there you will have like your corporate services and whatnot. That's going to be relatively easy. The approach is much similar at what you do externally, right? You have a set of let's say assign IPs, host names, domains, right? That will be relatively easy. I'm not saying it's like a piece of cake. But the problem with the users, because you have users who are in different buildings, you have users who are remotely, you have users who are not online today. So how are you correctly pulling all of that data? And one of the things we do is we prepare all of that assets to be ready for testing, right? So how I'm going to effectively inform Richard, like, hey, this user is not online today, so don't test it, right? But tomorrow it's online, so it's going to be a kind of a blind spot of, okay, we are missing out on stuff. So that I think that's the challenge I'm seeing. Uh, I've and what Chris mentioned, right? Like I've seen in the past, and I have used myself, like serve based on traffic, where you scan the traffic, and based on that you determine what technologies you have, and yeah, it gets really complicated. For now, I'd say I really like the approach of externally. For internally, uh, I guess servers, yeah, same approach. Users, something like agents. I think it's the best solution. Something like an EDR perhaps can give you more visibility. That's how I will probably do it. But it's definitely a fun challenge, right? It's fun.
Yeah, I'd say the only other challenge I ever see with internals is the uptime of services. When you're looking from the outside, traditionally these servers are built to take bulk scans. They're built to take the brunt of the world hitting them every day. And then you have some of these internal servers that if four people join it, it crashes. And now how do I at scale detect those? And then how do I, do my detections against them without knocking them down and causing, financial loss to the business of maybe hours of downtime?
That's a great call out. And again, talks about the emerging trend of it, right? Like there's going to be a lot more work to be done here. Shifting gears out of the emerging trends into more of like, how do we measure success, right? Like if we've got an ASM solution that's knocking over external things, like that's objectively bad, right? So how do we handle that? Sergio, what indicators or metrics do you think security leaders should focus on for both vuln management and ASM? Because, like Chris said, those are two different things, right? Vuln management is tracking what you know. ASM is finding everything else and reporting that. What indicators or metrics do you think would be effective to figure out?
Sure. I think the one that is more important for me at least, and that I present to my customers is uh, quarter over quarter or historic kind of trends, right? Like, hey, so last month we reported you with this number of bad stuff, right? How are you this month? Did any of that got solved? Did we report it more? And how effectively in time are you responding to all of that, right? So it's just measuring the time it's taking you not only to respond but also to fix. I think that's the important thing, and also some kind of interesting metrics. More from a size perspective is, okay, if you are a company that is growing in the number of assets it has, right? Like particularly for DNS, with DNS it gets really intricate. So if you jump from 1000 IP new subdomains, which is just DNS record really, uh, are you having high DNS hygiene issues in there, right? Or are you remaining? Are you being able to control that? I think those metrics are pretty interesting, right? Like, is your team able to handle all of these new subdomain, all of these new DNS madness in time with the resources they have? Because if not, okay, it's not necessarily a perspective of your team is doing bad, but it's a perspective of there is not enough resources to cover all of that because you are growing at a really fast pace. And this becomes kind of true when you look at big size organizations, right? With the smaller ones, it is like the numbers are weird because one single subdomain increases the attack surface in like 10%, right? So the numbers don't really make a lot of sense. But with much bigger organizations, they do, right? Like you don't want to have 1,000 of stale entries, right? So I think that's the two metrics I will hyper focus. One is size versus issues, and how fast are you responding and mitigating. I'd say those are the most important metrics for me.
So Richard, Sergio talked about responding and talked about, historical month over month, quarter over quarter. What are some areas where you're able to identify, like, is an ASM coverage not matching reality?
Yeah. So one of the biggest things I see is companies not understanding their dynamic assets versus static assets. So when they do these, large scale changes, it impacts a great deal of things. And 9 times out of 10, the things we're going to find are vulnerable configurations, sensitive information disclosure, or abandoned subdomain takeovers. And all those, like Sergio was saying, are hygiene issues that if we had, fixed early on in the process, we would have detected them sooner and been able to alleviate some of those pains. But now we've migrated to different assets because it's that dynamic infrastructure. Now we have to go through that whole process of relearning what this asset is. When if we did more of a baseline, hey, historically you've had these issues when your build images. Let's go ahead and fix them before we migrate again.
Awesome. And then Chris, anything to add from your perspective on the research side to better evaluate effectiveness?
Yeah, so it's interesting, Sergio, Richard, you both touched on hygiene, and I think what's fun, if I'm going to use that word in this context, ASM can be fun in the fact that it gives you a way to actually quantify hygiene, because like you said, Sergio, tracking trends month over month, quarter over quarter. Are we identifying and remediating things? Well, more so is the volume of shadow IT or rogue IT or whatever you want to call it, is it increasing or decreasing? Because that's a direct indicator of your hygiene, your practices, and your processes. If you have continuous stream of things you're not aware of popping up in your ASM solution, it's not up to your ASM solution to fix that. Yeah, it can not literally fix it, but it identifies the problem. But you need to go downstream of that and say, what are we doing wrong that we keep doing this thing wrong?
Yeah. And I think we get so bogged down with a finding having to be critical or having to be impactful right now, that we do gloss over those things that could become impactful later, the hygiene issues.
Yeah. So sorry, just to add something that I will say is not an indicator, because this is a conversation we tend to have. Is some organizations are kind of they want to have findings, they want to have criticals, and it's like you don't need to have them for your solution to be successful, right? You need to measure, like you mentioned, right, Chris? You need to measure, are you getting all of the data? Are you comparing this versus what you are supposed to be tracking to see if we have perhaps discovered more, right? Like those conversations that we have with some customers, like, hey, I discovered this domain, and they are like, no, that's not mine, and we provide the evidence, and it's like, yeah, that's mine, right? I think that is super relevant, and yeah, findings are important, right? Like, hey, yeah, you have this vulnerability. Okay, fine, but that doesn't have to be the driver for you to look for findings. No, it's actually also the lack of evidence in intelligence for the intelligence kind of community, right? Like the lack of evidence is also part of the evidence, right? It's also a good indicator of, okay, something is happening. We did something. If I had 5 findings the last month and now I'm having nothing, right? I did something different that helped, and that's also good, right? Like you need to understand that from both perspectives, and I don't just wait for a barrage of findings.
Yeah, I really want to dive in on Sergio's feedback of, like, it's more than just findings, because that is a conversation we've had to have for customers, right? I've been at Bishop Fox for over 5 years. We've had customers on the service for over 5 years. And because of the relationship with us as a service, their security posture has gotten better. They went from 100 findings a year to 50, now to 10. And now if we get one finding, like, we're stoked, right? Because we've able to see that maturity. And so to me, measuring an ASM's effectiveness is more than just a short time. Like, it's more than a short point in time assessment, right? Like, this is not a consulting engagement where we give you a clean bill of health in 1 week. An attack surface management solution is going to take a while, and it's going to be a long process. And you're going to be able to look back months, quarters, and years and say, like, man, we've matured as an organization, and we did that because of an effective ASM. So I think great input from everybody here. One of the questions that came up in chat was, what about false positives? If an ASM is all about identifying a known and trying to keep a good, signal to noise ratio, how do we identify false positives? What's the typical false positive rate for ASM workflows? Richard, since you're kind of our scanning and threat emulation guru, I want to kick it to you first.
Yeah, I think we have to, traditionally, when we think of false positives, we think of, oh, this asset's vulnerable, but it's really not vulnerable, right? I think we need to expand that a little bit and talk about false positives being that, hey, this is a critical issue right now, but it's not vulnerable to anything, right? So you see with some of these scanners out there, when you buy them, they say, hey, you're running Apache 2, it's vulnerable to everything. It's a critical, patch it now. And then you go through the process of actually trying to test out those vulnerabilities, and none of them are vulnerable to it, right? Traditionally, you get that report, that critical, you send someone and they report that out and they work it and they update it and you're good. I'm not saying don't update, please always update. I'm just saying, when it comes to prioritization, that's key, right? When you look at something like that is manually backed by people, we can evaluate those. So you get that alert comes in, says, hey, you're in Apache 2. We look up the vulnerabilities that impact Apache 2. We run our detections against them. We run our attempted exploits. They're failed. We figure out why they're failed. Hey, you got a WAF. Hey, you have some kind of mitigating circumstance. That's a load balancer, whatever have you. And then we can report it out as not vulnerable, right? And that decouples that need of the alerts versus the actual vulnerabilities. However, I'm not going to say there's never a false positive. I know traditionally in our world, when we have false positives, it's because an asset has rotated. It's normally a takeover, right? And we haven't reported as a takeover yet, but an asset has rotated. We've scanned it with detections. It's vulnerable to something, but the organization no longer owns that asset, right? Traditionally, Sergio and team can clean it up pretty fast before my team gets a hold of it. However, it doesn't always happen, but that's very rare. But we do have those kind of false positives where we report out a vulnerability that impacts an IP that you no longer own or that has rotated from your attack surface. And that is going to happen with almost any ASM, depending on how deep they go, or I should say how fast their rotations and discovery
you've
go.
talked about static versus dynamic and having organizations understand what their attack surface is. And you also mentioned Sergio's team. Sergio, do you want to walk us through what we do on the attack surface intelligence side of the house to help with that false positive rate?
Sure. And as I mentioned initially, right, like we do intelligence as part of the process because we want to reduce those false positives. So what we do is we look at the organizations as a whole. We understand what they are, like their legal name. And from there, we start looking from the top down, right? First, domains. We want to try to extract all of domains related to all of those organizations that are part of that brand or name. Once we have all of the domains discovered, we do subdomain enumeration, right? Using different techniques, using different tools. It's not like it's not rocket science, right? We are using a lot of tools that everyone else is using. Why? Because they are effective. So they are good, right? And that's the reality. Uh, what happens after that is we do a lot of like DNS resolutions, trying to understand where all of those entries pointing to, and from there we do this process called triage and trying to determine, right, if some of those, like proactively, if some of those domains that we discovered perhaps are abandoned, right? That yes, the organizations register them, but they are no longer with them. They forgot, or perhaps something else happened, right? Of if the subdomains that we discover are all just kind of wildcards, right? And it's just like if you try to resolve for anything to that domain, it will respond like, yeah, this exists, but it doesn't, right? So we do a lot of triage work to try to reduce the noise, right? Something that is important, however, is that it's not 100% accurate, right? If I say I'm gonna discover your entire attack surface with 100% accuracy, that's a lie, right? And that's why a managed service like this needs the partnership with the customers, right? Them having the input of, hey, by the way, I just acquired these organizations. It's not on the news. Hey, by the way, I just abandoned these domains, right? So you can keep tracking those. So we don't end up with these kind of quote unquote false positives, because they are not really false positives. It's just data that got lapsed, right? That is just off. And that is what we are observing. So that is why important this managed service to be like a partner relationship and not be treated like a black box of, no, I will not tell you anything, because it doesn't help you, right? And what we're trying is helping you, the organization.
Yeah, it's all about that collaborative environment with the customer. Chris, are you able to speak to this from the industry perspective on what the industry is trying to do to address false positives, because we don't want to waste cycles for our customers?
Yeah, so you guys are speaking my language. Like I said, I've established key features. Those are the differentiating features between ASM. The capability to assess vulnerabilities is one of those key features, and I can't. I wish I could. I wish I could weight these key features more heavily so that their score impacts positioning, because some are more important than others. This is definitely one of those. So hearing this conversation around how you assess vulnerabilities to reduce false positives, because that's really what we're trying to do. We want high fidelity confidence, high fidelity, high confidence alerts. I can say, kind of looking more broadly, we score on a scale of 0 to 5. You guys scored a 5 on your ability to assess vulnerabilities because of the human in the loop, because of the rigor, because of your discovery mechanisms, because of all the things. You guys have scored very well on this. Just sort of a blanket statement, not naming any names because that won't do anyone any good. This is one of those key features that's very important that some ASM vendors do very poorly. So, to the buyers that are out there watching this, to anyone who's interested in ASM, this is definitely an area that you need to ask a lot of questions about and not settle for the first reply.
There we go. Sorry,
Yeah.
chat window was messed up. I think that's a great thing to. One, thanks for the feedback. Right, like we've been very intentional in growing that out, and I know not every vendor does that because they're trying to tackle different problem sets. So I think it's good that there are different solutions out there for what customers need. Jumping into, we're quickly approaching time, and I want to save at least the last 5 minutes for Q&A. Chris, you did a great job kind of highlighting all of the things, but for any security leaders listening in, if they're thinking about investing or reassessing their attack surface management program, what's one question you would want them to ask a vendor or their internal team before signing on a dotted line?
Yeah, I would start with your internal team, your team leads, the people who are seeing the raw data, and have a really frank conversation with them to determine their confidence level in discovering and keeping track of, we call it the attack surface, but it's all the assets that are exposed on the internet or exposed internally or whatever the case may be, and really try to expand your definition of attack surface and expand their definition, because almost every single time you will find out they have high confidence on the things that they manage well, cloud resources, laptops, virtual machines, Kubernetes clusters, code repositories. We're really good at managing those things. But when we start getting out of those bounds and we start looking at SaaS platforms, we start looking at something as a service, well, our confidence level quickly drops. And that's really where you'll find the most value with ASM. So talk to your internal teams, have a really honest conversation with them and be like, how confident are you we're tracking everything that could present a risk to us? And I guarantee you they're going to come back and say, on this bucket of stuff, we're pretty confident. There's some things over here, though, I really don't know.
Yeah, the more layers of abstraction, it gets a little bit harder and harder. One of the questions that wrote in was, what are CISOs and SOC managers looking for to justify their first investment in ASM tools? You talked a little bit about green money. Getting that first pass is always easier, but what have you seen from senior leaders in the C-suite as well as SOC managers to help justify that?
Yeah, a really easy one, and this isn't just for large enterprise. I've seen startups with 50 people that this applies to. I've seen bootstrapped organizations with 30 employees that this applies to. Merger and acquisition activity. If you want to start talking their language, talk about how you can streamline M&A activity. You can get it done faster. You can maintain or improve your security posture through the process. And by the way, ASM is really good at doing that.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great answer. For any, practical tips, Sergio and Richard, do you guys have anything that you would wish, as we talk to security leaders kind of day in and day out on the service, what is one thing that you would want them to understand about their strategy?
I think I will want to echo something that Chris mentioned, right? Like understanding your attack surface is not just the your domain or your IPs, right? It goes beyond that. That is very important. You need to understand that it goes to certificates, cloud, SaaS. Like it's a lot, right? So you need to be able to be open to have that conversation with your ASM vendor, right? Like, hey, I don't want to hyper focus only on this because that will be kind of a very biased approach to only test a certain amount of assets. And I don't think that's helpful, right, for the future, for your cybersecurity maturity and posture. So it's been open to all of that, right? Like, again, echoing Chris, your attack surface goes much beyond that. I think that's the one thing I will love. Yep.
Awesome. Anything from you, Richard?
Yeah, I'll add that. Remember, it's people. It's people dealing with people, right? When you partner with an attack surface management company, the idea is to partner with them. It's not to set it and forget it, right? It's have open communications, open dialogue. When you know your attack surface is changing, let us know before we do. When we know it changes, we let you know, right? It's that communication and collaboration. I think a lot of times we're viewed as the adversary to the internal teams because they don't deal with us. It's that red versus blue mentality where, they intentionally leave the WAF on so we find nothing and then say, ha, you suck because you can't do anything. It's like, no, we can't scan you the way an attacker would, right? We do have legal bindings that we can't go around. So it is that communication that we're not adversaries. We are a tool that you're using in your inventory that we need to be partners with. Because I know a lot of times with us, if we have a client that is heavy on the dynamic, we'll talk about golden image searches or offer other suggestions within Bishop Box that may help them better than we would, right? And that's just the honesty of it,
Awesome.
So,
well, this has been a great chat, and I really do appreciate everybody kind of leaning in. Moving into the Q&A section again, if you're here and you have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, and we'll try to address those. One of the first questions that stood out to me was on validating exploitability, right? Getting rid of that false positive noise. What are our concerns around safety? What have we seen in the industry around safety? How do we prevent knocking over assets during testing? Is there a way to, have metrics with that? Richard, I'll throw it to you for that.
Yeah, sure. So sometimes the only metric you have is the client telling you you knocked it over. Right. There are times where the asset is behind an API or a load balancer, and you're still able to hit it. The service died when you threw your exploit. Right. So some of that can't be metriced that way. When we do knock an asset down, we do a root cause analysis to figure out what happened and kind of like go over it with you. It very seldomly happens because we do have those communication efforts with our partners. Right. I think a lot of it boils down to the rules of engagement you have. We have clients here that have very sensitive things that say, hey, no manual testing at all. I don't care if it's top 10 critical, don't touch it manually, right? And then once we find those, there's no validation and we pass them over. And we have other clients that can say, hey, none of these are important. If you knock them down, just let us know and we'll reboot them, right? Those kind of conversations help to lower those risks of us knocking things over. But it's inevitably going to happen. At Bishop Box, there are things we don't do. We don't do denial of service exploit testing. We don't do any kind of overflows that don't have a proven history of success. So if we do have one that's on the newer side, or we do have one that is a higher risk to knocking over the service, we won't even run it. We'll stop at detection, say, hey, we've validated it's vulnerable to this based on these 3 factors, these 4 factors, whatever we have determined, and go. And a lot of times you'll see with the emerging threat process, we do that a lot. Say, hey, this is vulnerable. Here's the reason why we know it's vulnerable. Here's the version we know it to be. Here's the endpoint we know is exposed. We're not even going to touch this. You just need to fix it before someone else knocks it down. But yeah, it's never going to happen, unfortunately. It's just one of those things where the response hopefully comes faster than not.
And I think, to add an additional perspective to answer that question is like, that's a conversation you need to have with your vendor, right? As an organization, as you're purchasing a solution from a security consulting firm or whatever else, you need to understand what they're going to test, right? Like Richard alluded to, we don't do denial of service testing. We don't think that there's value in that at scale, but some customers may want that. And so they might need to go use that radar to build out that list of, here are the orgs that I want to talk to and who's going to meet my needs as it relates to me in security.
Yeah. And one more thing I forgot to mention, that should be considered a vulnerability, right? Like your uptime, your services running, if they're exposed to the internet or the world and they can be knocked down with a single call, like that should be addressed. Not that we would do that for you, but definitely something to consider a vulnerability.
Availability.
Right. Not the availability. Yeah.
Yeah, if you've got frail, brittle infrastructure sitting out there, that's not a good place to be if you're, a company that makes dollars off of having uptime. So I know we're running at the end of time. There's been a few questions that have come in. We're going to make sure that we send answers back via email. One of the questions, this one's for Sergio, was, following up on that OSINT question, how do we identify and what tools do we use? Specifically looking at subdomain enumeration and understanding IPs. Can you give us like a top 3, top 5 of subdomain enumeration and maybe like the IP network block research that we do for our customers?
Sure. For subdomain enumeration, I will look at, again, CRT.sh. It does a great job of subdomain versus certificate, right? So you have your evidence at the same time. Different tools from Project Discovery, gonna shout out them because they are great, honestly. SubFinder is one of our main tools. We have DNSDB. It's another one that we like a lot. I think with those, you have already a lot of information, right? Like for starters. As for IP, any source of IP such as ARIN, any source of BGP information like Team Kimru, BGP data set, I think that's great. And Shodan, right? Like it's not about a number of tools you use. It's about having tools that are known to provide you with accurate recent information, and you being able to going back to the ease of use, right? Those are of really ease of use for you to quickly use as evidence. You want solid evidence. So I think those are great examples, right?
1,000%. Yeah, you don't need a lot of tools. You just need tools that are well taken care of, right? A sharp axe is going to cut down a tree way faster than 3 different tools trying to attack it. So, like I said, if you guys have any other questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. We'll continue to address those kind of after the fact and make sure everybody feels like we've closed the loop on them. But I know we're at time. I do want to thank everyone for taking the time to come out. As we wrap today, I do want to highlight a few additional resources. We've got that radar report that's publicly available. We've got the Cosmos Explained video kind of walking through what the service is, what we do, and how we do that for customers, empowering security teams, keeping that high signal to noise. And then we've got our Cosmos ASM data sheet, again, explaining what we do, how we do it, and why we do it the way we do. So if you guys need anything, please reach out to our marketing team. They've been amazing. If you have any further questions, feel free to throw them in. And again, huge thank you to Chris, Sergio, and Richard for taking the time and sharing your expertise. It's been a great chat.
Thank you, guys. It was my pleasure.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Yeah.